May 1, 1972. NBC Studios, Burbank, Studio 1. The stage lights ran hot enough to turn makeup into a second job. A thin haze, part cigarette smoke, part electrical heat, hung just above the first rows. Off to one side, a stagehand watched the red tally light blink on a camera like a small warning. The applause sign flared, the audience rose on instinct, and then, right on cue, settled into the quiet that always came a fraction of a second before he arrived. In that pause, the desk waited. It was not a large desk, but on American television it became a border. One side belonged to the audience and the guests, actors, politicians, comics, athletes, authors, people who needed something from the night. The other side belonged to the man who didn't have to ask permission to be there. Johnny Carson stepped through the curtain as if he had merely been delayed, not introduced. He adjusted his jacket with the smallest, almost unconscious movement. He looked toward the desk. He looked past it. He looked into the room with the practiced calm of someone who understood that control is most convincing when it never announces itself. This was the West Coast now. The show had moved its center of gravity from New York to California, closer to studios, closer to agents, closer to the machinery that manufactured celebrity and repaired it when it broke. The relocation itself signaled something important. Late-night television was no longer just a broadcast, it was an industry node. It could lift careers, soften reputations, redirect headlines, and seal a cultural verdict in under an hour. By the early 1970s, Carson was no longer simply hosting The Tonight Show, he was presiding over it. The desk anchored the ritual. The format was deceptively simple: monologue, desk beat, guests, music, yet it became the modern blueprint for late night itself. The show's structure, built around that desk, hardened into tradition. A monologue of quick one-liners, sketches, interviews, performances, delivered in a way that suggested ease while requiring relentless precision. Television historians have noted how Carson's Tonight Show established the modern format of the late-night talk show, with its disciplined rhythm and its careful balance between comedy and conversation. And this was the era when appearing on The Tonight Show meant something specific. It meant legitimacy. It meant a kind of national introduction that could not be replicated by a magazine profile or a studio press tour. For a comedian, it could mean the difference between being a name on a club marquee and being a name a producer recognized. For an actor, it could mean a shift from working to wanted. For a politician, it could mean becoming familiar, becoming safe enough to invite into the living room at the end of the day. Carson understood that intimacy better than almost anyone who has ever held a broadcast audience. He didn't sell intimacy as warmth, he sold it as steadiness. He was not there to confess, he was there to manage the room. Even in 1979, when he spoke about comedy and television in a rare, in-depth interview, he returned again and again to the idea that timing and immediacy mattered, and that the aura of risk was part of pure television. The audience, he suggested, could feel when something was truly happening right now, when there was no safety net of post-production, no edited second chance. But the more essential truth was quieter. Carson's authority didn't come from chaos, it came from restraint, from the way he could make a studio full of people and millions at home feel that everything was under control, even when it wasn't. That control began before he ever reached the desk. In the minutes before airtime, a private system ran behind the curtain. In Burbank, executive producer Fred DeCordova would warm the audience, working the room, feeding anticipation, managing expectation. Ed McMahon would handle the formalities, rules, applause, timing, while Doc Severinsen and the band prepared the sound that would pull Carson into the room like a familiar signal. This was the architecture of ritual, and it mattered, because a ritual creates trust. The Library of Congress, which holds extensive Tonight Show production files from 1970 onward, scripts, schedules, cue cards, and broadcast standards reports, describes the show's laid-back style as something carefully engineered, not accidental. The archives capture that paradox, an air of improvisation built on documentation, annotation, and review. The desk, then, wasn't merely furniture, it was the physical proof of a contract between performer and public. You come here night after night, and I will not let the room fall apart. That is why the monologue mattered.
It was not only the opening laughs, it was the test of mastery. Carson faced the audience alone, without guests, without buffer, without the conversation.
And yet, for all the calm, the monologue was never truly safe. The difference between a solid opening and a cold room could be measured in seconds. A joke could land wrong, a rhythm could slip, a topical line could feel suddenly unfunny if the audience sensed cruelty. Carson himself acknowledged that certain subjects turned from funny to uncomfortable the moment the underlying human reality became visible. He cited cases where public scandal stopped being fodder once it revealed alcoholism or personal collapse. That kind of calibration, fast, intuitive, and public, was not just comedic instinct, it was moral navigation. This is where the promise in your title, Monologues That Destroyed the Audience, needs its mature translation. Carson did not destroy the audience through aggression, he dismantled them through accuracy. A one-liner that pinned the news to the wall, a pause that invited the room to catch up, a raised eyebrow that acknowledged the joke's danger without indulging it. The audience wasn't a target, it was an instrument, and Carson played it with discipline. What people expected, night after night, was competence, polished jokes, controlled laughter, familiar structure. What sometimes happened instead was something more revealing, the monologue becoming an arena where the illusion of ease was visibly manufactured in real time. Watch the way the desk functions in those moments. When the monologue hits cleanly, the desk is a destination, a place to land. When the monologue strains, the desk becomes a shield, something Carson can retreat toward, something that promises the audience, we will be safe again in a moment. Even his physical movement, standing for the monologue, then turning toward the desk, signals a shift from open performance to controlled conversation. The desk marks the boundary between exposure and command. Carson's greatest monologues were not simply strings of jokes, they were cultural weather reports, short, sharp readings of what America could laugh at that night, and therefore what it could tolerate, what it could forgive, what it could admit without saying out loud. The Library of Congress piece notes that Carson's monologue was treated by de Cordova as the pride and joy of the program, and it emphasizes how the show's laid-back style was the product of control, artistry, and hard work. It also describes the broadcast standards process, the network's review system that could cut or bloop lines before air. Even that is part of the story. Carson operated inside a system of standards, yet the show's identity depended on the feeling that Carson was not being managed by anyone. That illusion, control without visible enforcement, is exactly what the desk represented. Consider how Carson dealt with the rare moment that control slipped into view. In the Rolling Stone account of a taping night, Carson delivers his monologue briskly, then, during a station break, lets out a blunt expletive, precisely timed so it would not go out over the broadcast. It's a small act, but it reveals a larger truth. The man who seemed effortless was always watching the machinery. The calm was not innocence, it was awareness. That is why the best monologue moments often feel like controlled near misses. Not chaos, never chaos, but tension. The sense that the room could go cold, that the joke could fail, that the news could be too sharp, that the standards department might object, that a guest later in the hour might not cooperate. The audience laughed partly because Carson made it safe to laugh, and partly because they sensed he was doing it live, balancing precision on the edge of public embarrassment. When the monologue truly destroyed the room, it usually happened in one of three ways. First, the perfect topical cut. Carson could take the day's political absurdity and reduce it to a single line that felt less like a joke than like a verdict. He was careful about politics in the sense that he did not preach, but he understood that the country's mood changed quickly. He described how jokes about public figures like Spiro Agnew or Richard Nixon would land differently depending on whether the audience felt the figure represented stability or deserved ridicule. A monologue could become a kind of public poll, instant and unscientific, but emotionally real. Second, the crafted running pattern. Carson's monologue wasn't always about one big punch. It could be about a sustained rhythm, a series of one-liners that created momentum until the audience had no time to recover.
The Wikipedia overview notes the typical monologue structure, rapid-fire one-liners with an internal rule of variety to avoid overloading one topic. The effect was cumulative, like tightening a bolt one turn at a time until laughter became inevitable. Third, the public recovery. This may be the most Carson of all. When something didn't land, he could rescue it without appearing rattled. Sometimes the recovery itself became the joke.
Carson's private nature was not just personality. It was part of the mechanism. He rarely socialized with guests before or after the show, according to many accounts, preferring the encounter to happen on camera, where he controlled the context. That choice protected the mystique. The relationship was not with the guest, it was with the audience. Ed McMahon, in later interviews, described a working relationship defined by minimal explicit praise and maximum expectation. Carson, he said, assumed you would do your job. If you didn't hear from him, you were doing well. That standard of quiet judgment created an atmosphere where people stayed sharp, not because they feared humiliation, but because they feared letting down the rhythm. This is the subtle intimidation of Carson's world. Not shouting, not tantrums, just the knowledge that the desk and the show belonged to someone who could end your access with a decision you might never hear spoken aloud. The audience rarely saw that side. What they saw was a man who appeared to trust himself completely, and that is what they trusted in return. When Carson sat behind the desk, the nation accepted an unspoken arrangement. We will give you our last waking minutes, and you will give us a version of the day we can live with. The best monologues did not merely make people laugh, they changed the emotional temperature of the country's night. They also changed the careers of the people who stepped onto that stage. A successful appearance could translate into bookings, record sales, film offers, network interest. The power was not mystical, it was industrial. The Tonight Show was a pipeline, and Carson was the gate. People often said a comedian made it after Carson. That phrasing is revealing. It implies not just exposure, but certification. The show did not merely present talent, it judged it, quietly in front of millions. Even the archival record reflects that seriousness. The Library of Congress piece notes that the production files include cue cards, chronologies, scripts, and broadcast standards reports, documents that show how much labor sat beneath the apparent ease. If historians one day look to Carson's monologues as cultural evidence, as De Cordova suggested, echoing comparisons to Will Rogers, it will be because the monologues captured what could be said safely, humorously, at the end of the day in America. That brings us back to the desk. The desk is where the mythology of late night lives, the belief that a single person can sit in a well-lit room and make the country feel coherent for 60 minutes. The desk is also where the machinery hides, the cue cards, the timing marks, the commercial breaks, the network standards, the crew's vigilance. Carson's genius was that he made the machinery feel like manners. He didn't announce that he was in charge, he behaved like someone who had always been in charge, and therefore never needed to prove it. Even in moments of irritation, about sound problems, about disruption, accounts suggest the anger was not theatrical, it was procedural. The show was a precision instrument, and Carson treated failure as interference. And because the show was taped the same day without being edited down like other programs, the risk remained visible enough to matter. Carson himself argued that taping the same day carried the same value as live broadcasting because the essential element, the lack of post-production rescue, was intact. The audience sensed this. It is part of why his monologues could feel like events rather than content. Now, the phrase destroyed the audience can be understood in its truest historical form. Carson's monologues overwhelmed the room not by force, but by timing so exact that resistance was pointless. The audience wasn't battered, it was carried. It was guided into laughter with the assurance that someone competent was steering. There is an emotional philosophy inside that method. Performance versus authenticity is often treated as a modern anxiety, but Carson lived it in a cleaner, older form. On camera, he was accessible. Off camera, he was difficult to know. In interviews, colleagues describe a man of deep reticence, someone who could be generous, even tender, but who struggled with overt displays. That divide wasn't hypocrisy, it was a boundary. It preserved the show's central promise. The audience didn't need to know him personally. They needed to believe he was steady.
America trusted Johnny Carson because he did not ask America to take care of him. He took care of the hour. The desk made that visible. Every night he returned to the same spot, the same posture, the same rhythm. The sameness was not boring, it was reassuring. The country could change. Politics, war, scandal, cultural shifts, and still, at the end of the day, the desk remained, and the man behind it did not appear frightened. Even the physical details became part of the national memory. The curtain opening, the band's theme, the introduction, the monologue, the move to the desk. The Library of Congress article calls it a ritual, like a ceremony, a traditional dance, executed with near perfection. That repetition is not incidental. Repetition is how mass trust is built. And when Carson's monologues were at their best, they did something else. They made the country feel briefly intelligent. Not academically intelligent, socially intelligent. As if the audience had caught the joke not only because it was funny, but because they understood the world well enough to laugh at it. That is a form of power. It is also a form of responsibility. In the end, Carson's authority was invisible because it was never declared. It was embedded in process, reinforced by standards, protected by a private temperament, and symbolized, night after night, by a desk that separated the performer from the room while making the room feel closer than it was. Decades later, the desk survives as an idea more than an object. The show is archived, the clips circulate, the theme music is instantly recognizable, the format has been inherited by successors who measure themselves against a standard they did not set. But the deeper inheritance is subtler, the belief that the country can still be gathered, briefly, around a single voice that does not panic. May 22, 1992. Carson's final Tonight Show ended without guests, just reflection, controlled and direct. He spoke of being lucky, of having enjoyed the work, of thanking the men beside him and the people watching at home. It was not a grand speech. It was a professional closing. The desk, for the last time, held the weight of a nation's attention and then released it. That is the larger truth behind the monologues that destroyed the audience. The laughter was real, sometimes explosive, sometimes helpless, but the more enduring achievement was what surrounded it, the calm structure that made millions feel they were sharing the same room, at the same time, under the same lights, listening to the same measured voice. Television, at its highest level, is not simply entertainment. It is a shared national experience that teaches a country how to feel about itself. For 30 years, Johnny Carson sat behind a desk and made that experience look effortless. And that was the illusion, precise, disciplined, and deeply American.